The F/A-18 Super Hornet screamed through the churning gray clouds at 150 knots, its twin engines fighting against wind shear that could snap an aircraft in half. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen gripped the stick with hands that had steadied through combat missions over 3 different theaters, but tonight's approach to the USS Gerald R felt like threading a needle in an earthquake. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Phoenix, you're drifting left of centerline," came the voice of Lieutenant Rodriguez, the landing signal officer whose calm tone couldn't mask the tension crackling through the radio. "Winds gusting 45 knots, deck pitching 12 degrees. Wave off if you can't maintain your approach." Sarah's jaw tightened. Through the rain-lashed canopy, she could barely make out the carrier's flight deck, a postage stamp of steel rolling through 15-foot swells in the North Atlantic's worst storm in 20 years. The ship's lights blurred into streaks of yellow and red, the landing area looking impossibly small from her cockpit perspective. "Negative on the wave-off," she transmitted back, her voice steady despite her heart hammering against her ribs. "Phoenix is committed to approach." The squadron had called it lucky. Sarah knew better. Luck was what happened when preparation met opportunity, and she'd prepared for this moment her entire career. The carrier deck rushed up to meet her, disappearing and reappearing as the massive ship crested each wave. Sarah's altimeter spun like a slot machine as she fought to maintain the precise 3.5-degree glide slope that would either land her safely or send $35 million of aircraft into the ocean. Behind her, fuel burned away with each passing second, enough for maybe 2 more approaches before she'd have to divert to shore, assuming she could even find a runway in this weather. "Phoenix, you're high and fast," Rodriguez called out. "Deck's coming up. Power back, nose down." The moment of truth arrived in a blur of spray and steel. Sarah's Hornet slammed onto the deck with bone-jarring force, her tailhook catching the number 3 wire with a metallic shriek that could be heard even over the howling wind. The sudden deceleration threw her forward against her harness as 60,000 pounds of aircraft went from flying to stopped in less than 2 seconds. For a heartbeat, everything went silent, except for the rain drumming against her canopy. Then the deck crew swarmed her aircraft, their yellow jerseys bright against the gray morning as they chained down her Hornet and signaled her to shut down engines. "Phoenix, welcome aboard," came the voice of Air Boss Captain Marcus Webb from Primary Flight Control, 4 stories above the flight deck. That was one hell of an approach. Sarah pulled off her helmet and ran fingers through sweat-dampened black hair, her hands finally allowing themselves to tremble now that she was safe. Through her side window, she watched the deck crew working with practiced efficiency, despite conditions that would ground civilian aircraft indefinitely. These were her people. Navy aviators, deck crew, and ship's company who understood that sometimes you had to do the impossible because lives depended on it. As she climbed down from her cockpit, Chief Petty Officer Martinez, her plane captain, grinned up at her through the rain. "Another happy landing, Phoenix. Though I gotta say, watching you come down through that soup made my hair go gray." "Your hair's been gray since before I was born, Chief," Sarah shot back, the familiar banter helping her decompress from the adrenaline rush. But as she looked back at the storm-tossed ocean stretching endlessly in all directions, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight's landing was just the beginning of something much bigger than weather. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. Creating and narrating these detailed, novel-length stories takes tremendous time and research to bring you the most engaging content possible. We're embarking on a journey of nearly 50,000 words together. That's a full novella. If you're already hooked by what you've heard, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this story with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. This is going to be an epic adventure, so get comfortable and let's continue with this remarkable tale. The USS Gerald R. Ford's ready room buzzed with the controlled chaos that preceded every mission briefing. But today's atmosphere carried an undercurrent of tension that made even veteran aviators check their gear twice. Sarah Chen sat in the front row, her flight suit crisp, despite having spent the last 18 hours either in the cockpit or on standby alert. Around her, 12 other pilots from VFA-87, the Golden Warriors, reviewed their mission packets with the focused intensity of surgeons preparing for a complex operation. Commander Jake Viper Morrison, the squadron's commanding officer, strode to the front of the room with the confident gait of someone who'd logged over 3,000 carrier landings. His weathered face bore the lines of a man who'd seen combat in 3 different decades, and when he spoke, even the most cocky nugget pilot shut up and listened. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Viper began, his gray eyes scanning the assembled aviators. At 0400 this morning, satellite reconnaissance detected unusual activity at the Kola Peninsula. Russian Northern Fleet assets have been moving in patterns we haven't seen since the Cold War. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her pilot's instincts already processing the implications. The Kola Peninsula housed Russia's most sensitive naval installations, including their nuclear submarine bases. Any unusual activity there could signal anything from a training exercise to the beginning of something that would make headlines around the world. "Our mission," Viper continued, clicking to the next slide showing a detailed map of the Barents Sea, "is to conduct armed reconnaissance along the international boundary. We'll be flying in 2-ship formations, maintaining constant communication with the ship, and under no circumstances are we to cross into Russian territorial waters." Lieutenant Danny Sox Patterson, a nugget pilot on his first deployment, raised his hand. "Sir, what exactly constitutes unusual activity?" Viper's expression darkened slightly. 3 Yasen-class attack submarines left port simultaneously. That's unprecedented. Add to that increased air patrols by their Tu-95 Bears and Su-30s, and we're looking at either the largest training exercise they've conducted in years, or something else entirely. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Yasen-class submarines were among the most advanced in the Russian fleet, capable of launching cruise missiles at targets over 1,000 miles away. 3 of them operating together represented enough firepower to level every major port on the eastern seaboard. "Phoenix," Viper said, making eye contact with her, "you'll be flying lead with Hammer as your wingman. Your flight path takes you within 50 miles of their territorial boundary. I want constant updates on anything you see out there." Lieutenant Tony Hammer Kowalski nodded from the seat beside her. Sarah had flown with Hammer before. He was solid, reliable, and had the kind of steady nerves that made him perfect for reconnaissance work, where trigger discipline could mean the difference between gathering intelligence and starting World War III. After the briefing, Sarah found herself walking the Ford's endless corridors toward the flight deck, her mind already shifting into the focused headspace she needed for combat missions. The carrier was a city at sea, home to over 5,000 souls who depended on pilots like her to project American power across the world's oceans. The responsibility never felt heavier than in moments like these, when the line between peacekeeping and warfare became razor thin. The ship's meteorology officer, Lieutenant Janet Sullivan, intercepted her near the island superstructure. "Phoenix, I wanted to give you an update on conditions. The storm system that hit us last night is moving northeast, but you're going to encounter another front about 200 miles out. Visibility drops to under 5 miles, with potential icing conditions above 15,000 feet. "Wonderful," Sarah muttered, already calculating how the weather would complicate their mission. Flying reconnaissance required clear visibility to accurately identify contacts, but the weather patterns over the North Atlantic in October were notoriously unpredictable. "There's something else," Sullivan continued, lowering her voice. "We're tracking some unusual electromagnetic signatures from the same region you're heading to. Could be atmospheric interference from the storm, but our electronics warfare specialists think it might be active jamming." Sarah paused mid-stride. Electronic jamming during peacetime operations violated several international treaties, but more importantly, it suggested that whatever the Russians were doing, they didn't want outside observers getting a clear picture of it. On the flight deck, launch operations were underway with ordnance crews making final weapons checks. Sarah's Hornet sat on catapult number 2, loaded with AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles, and equipped with the latest reconnaissance pod that could photograph objects in detail from over 30 miles away. Chief Martinez completed his methodical pre-flight inspection because he knew that a single overlooked detail could cost a pilot their life. "She's ready to go, Phoenix," he reported, handing her the maintenance logbook to sign. "All systems green, full fuel load, and I personally checked every connection on that recon pod. Whatever's out there, you'll see it coming." Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence, her hands moving through the familiar checklist with automatic precision while her mind remained focused on the mission ahead. The twin F-414 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, and within minutes she was reporting ready to the air boss. "Phoenix, you're cleared for launch," came Captain Webb's voice from primary flight control. "Good hunting out there." The catapult launch slammed Sarah back into her seat with 4 gigaseconds of acceleration, transforming her from stationary to 150 knots in 2.5 seconds. The Ford's deck fell away beneath her as she climbed into the gray North Atlantic sky, hammer forming up on her right wing with the practiced ease of hundreds of previous flights together. "Phoenix Flight, you're cleared to mission frequency," the departure controller radioed. "Contact Overlord on 251.5. "Phoenix Flight, switching," Sarah acknowledged, changing to the encrypted frequency that would keep them in contact with the Ford's Combat Information Center throughout their mission. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Sarah took a moment to appreciate the view. The North Atlantic stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted in shades of gray and white by the morning light filtering through broken clouds. Far below, the Ford's wake carved a straight line through the swells, the carrier maintaining course and speed while her aircraft conducted the business of gathering intelligence. "Overlord, Phoenix Flight checking in," Sarah transmitted. "2 Hornets airborne, proceeding to Point Alpha." "Phoenix Flight," Overlord copies. "Be advised, we're tracking multiple air contacts bearing 040 at approximately 200 miles. Presumed Russian air patrol." Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. Russian air patrols this far from their home bases weren't unusual, but the timing and location suggested they were flying cover for whatever was happening on the surface below. "Overlord, Phoenix copies. What's the bearing to our nearest divert field if things get interesting?" "Phoenix, closest friendly runway is Keflavik, Iceland, bearing 270 at 400 miles. Weather's marginal but improving." 400 miles. In an FA-18, that represented about an hour of flying time under normal conditions. But if they encountered trouble or had to burn fuel maneuvering against hostile aircraft, it could become uncomfortably tight. Sarah made a mental note to keep close track of their fuel consumption throughout the mission. As they passed through 20,000 feet, Hammer's voice crackled over the tactical frequency. "Phoenix, I'm picking up electronic interference on my radar. Looks like jamming from multiple sources." Sarah checked her own displays and confirmed the same signature Sullivan had warned her about. The electronic warfare panel showed active jamming across multiple frequency bands, creating a haze of interference that would make identifying targets at long range nearly impossible. "Hammer, let's descend to 15,000 and try to get under the worst of it. Stay alert for air contacts." They dropped altitude and headed northeast toward their patrol area, the electronic interference gradually decreasing as they got closer to the source. Sarah's tactical radar began painting clearer contacts on the surface below. Multiple ships operating in formation, their radar signatures suggesting everything from destroyers to support vessels. "Phoenix, Overlord," came the voice of the Combat Information Center controller. "We're showing you approaching the patrol area. What do you see out there?" Sarah activated her reconnaissance pod and began photographing the surface contacts. Through her HUD, she could make out the angular silhouettes of Russian warships maintaining precise formation spacing. But it was what she couldn't see that made her blood run cold. "Overlord, Phoenix has visual on a surface action group. Count 7 surface combatants in formation, but I'm not seeing any submarine signatures on sonar." "Phoenix, that's impossible. Our satellite intel clearly showed 3 submarines departing Severodvinsk 12 hours ago." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. 3 nuclear attack submarines somewhere in these waters, effectively invisible to her sensors due to the electronic jamming. If they were conducting an exercise, why hide their positions? And if they weren't conducting an exercise? "Hammer, tighten up the formation." "I don't like how quiet things are down there." As if summoned by her words, her radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with the high-pitched tone that meant someone had just locked on to them with targeting radar. Sarah's training kicked in before her conscious mind had time to process the threat. "Phoenix Flight, missile launch, brake right, deploy chaff." The next 30 seconds unfolded in the deadly ballet that separated living pilots from dead ones. Sarah yanked her Hornet into a 7G turn, her vision graying at the edges as she fought to defeat an incoming SAN-9 surface-to-air missile launched from one of the Russian destroyers below. Strips of metallic chaff bloomed from her aircraft like deadly confetti, creating false radar returns to confuse the missile's guidance system. "Phoenix, I've got multiple air contacts bearing 040, range 50 miles, and closing fast." Hammer's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone who just realized their reconnaissance mission had become something much more dangerous. Sarah leveled out from her defensive maneuver and checked her displays. 6 Russian fighters, looked like a mix of Su-30s and MiG-29s, were accelerating toward their position from the direction of the Kola Peninsula. The mathematical reality of their situation hit her like a physical blow. 2 American fighters against 6 Russian interceptors, over 400 miles from the nearest friendly runway, with 3 unaccounted-for submarines somewhere below them. "Overlord Phoenix, we are engaged. Repeat, we are engaged by Russian air and surface units, requesting immediate support." The response from the Ford crackled with static, but Captain Webb's voice came through clearly enough to understand the gravity of their situation. "Phoenix Flight, be advised the nearest help is 30 minutes out. You are cleared to defend yourselves, but under no circumstances cross into Russian territorial waters." Sarah looked at her moving map display and felt her heart sink. The international boundary lay less than 20 miles to the east, and the Russian fighters were approaching from that direction. If she turned west to avoid violating territorial waters, she'd be flying directly away from the Ford and deeper into the Atlantic, where her fuel would run out long before she could reach friendly territory. "Hammer, we're going to have to fight our way out of this one," she transmitted, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Stay close. Watch your fuel consumption, and remember, we need to get home with enough information to explain what we saw out here." As the Russian fighters closed to within 30 miles, Sarah armed her AIM-120 AMRAAMs and prepared for what would either be the shortest air-to-air engagement of her career or the last one she'd ever fight. The storm clouds gathered around them seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the human tempest about to break loose over the North Atlantic. The lead Russian fighter pilot's voice crackled over the international emergency frequency, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "American aircraft, you are approaching a restricted military exercise area. Turn west immediately or we will escort you away." Sarah keyed her radio and responded with the kind of diplomatic precision they drilled into her at the Naval War College. "Russian aircraft, this is United States Navy Flight Phoenix, operating in international airspace. We are not approaching your territorial waters and request you maintain safe separation." "American aircraft, this is Colonel Viktor Petrov, Russian Air Force. You will turn west now, or we will consider your presence a hostile act." The name sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She'd studied Petrov's record during her intelligence briefings. A veteran pilot with over 200 combat hours over Syria and Ukraine, known for aggressive tactics and an unwillingness to back down from confrontations with Western aircraft. If Moscow had sent him to lead this intercept, they were sending a message about how seriously they took whatever operation was unfolding below. "Phoenix, I'm showing missile lock-on signals from multiple aircraft," Hammer reported, his voice tight with concentration. "They're not just escorting us, they're getting ready to shoot." Sarah made the decision that would define the rest of her career, and possibly the rest of her life. Instead of turning west and allowing the Russians to dictate the terms of engagement, she turned her Hornet directly toward the approaching fighters. "Hammer, Phoenix is engaging. Take the trailing element." Quote, "Phoenix, are you insane? We're outnumbered 3-1. "Maybe, but we're not outflown. Follow my lead." Sarah selected her first AMRAAM and waited for the targeting computer to achieve lock-on. The Russian formation was now 25 miles out and closing at a combined speed of over 1,000 knots. In less than 2 minutes, they'd either be in a dogfight that would test every skill she'd learned over 10 years of naval aviation, or they'd be floating in life rafts in the North Atlantic waiting for rescue that might never come. The electronic warfare environment suddenly changed as the Russian jamming system shut down, revealing the true scope of what was happening beneath the clouds. Sarah's radar display lit up with dozens of contacts, not just the surface ships she'd photographed, but submarine periscopes, small craft, and what looked like offshore drilling platforms that hadn't been there on yesterday's satellite images. "Overlord Phoenix, whatever the Russians are doing down here, it's not a training exercise. I'm seeing what looks like a major infrastructure installation in progress." Uploading reconnaissance data now. As her aircraft's computer transmitted the digital photographs and radar data back to the Ford, Sarah realized that she and Hammer had stumbled into something that would either prevent a war or start one. The Russians weren't just conducting military exercises. They were building something in international waters, something important enough to defend with their best pilots and most advanced ships. Colonel Petrov's voice came over the radio again, but this time without the diplomatic pleasantries. "American pilots, you have seen too much. Surrender now, and we will ensure your safe return to your carrier. Continue your current heading, and we will destroy you." Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and calculated their options. They had enough fuel for maybe 15 more minutes of combat maneuvering before they'd have to start thinking about getting home. The Russian fighters were close enough now that she could see their angular silhouettes through the broken clouds, and the surface-to-air missile sites below were tracking her every move. "Hammer, we're going to make one high-speed pass through their formation, then bug out for home. On my mark, light the afterburners and follow me down." "Phoenix, this is either brilliant or suicidal." "Let's hope it's brilliant." Quote. Sarah pushed her throttles into the afterburner and dove toward the ocean, her Hornet accelerating past Mach 1.2 as she aimed for the gap between the first two Russian fighters. The next few minutes would test every lesson she'd learned about survival in aerial combat, but more importantly, they would determine whether the intelligence she'd gathered would make it back to the Ford, and whether the world would learn what the Russians were really building in the depths of the North Atlantic. The merge happened at 25,000 feet with a combined closing speed that would have liquefied any pilot who wasn't strapped into a fighter aircraft. Sarah's Hornet screamed between two Su-30 flankers with less than 100 feet of separation, the Russian pilots rolling inverted to track her movement as she punched through their formation like a bullet through paper. "Fox 3, she called out, launching her first AMRAAM at the trailing flanker as it attempted to turn with her. The missile's rocket motor ignited in a streak of white fire, arcing through the gray morning sky toward its target with the relentless precision of mathematics and physics. Behind her, Hammer engaged the second element of Russian fighters with his own missile shot, but Sarah didn't have time to watch the outcome. Colonel Petrov had anticipated her high-speed pass and was already positioning his aircraft for a head-on attack that would put both pilots within gun range in a matter of seconds. "American pilot, you fight well," Petrov transmitted, his voice carrying what might have been professional respect. "But you cannot escape what you have seen here." Sarah's missile found its mark with a bright flash visible even through the cloud layer, sending the trailing Su-30 into an uncontrolled spin toward the ocean below. She didn't see whether the pilot ejected. At this altitude and speed, there wasn't time to confirm kills or count parachutes. There was only the immediate tactical situation and the desperate mathematics of survival. "Phoenix, I'm defensive." Hammer's voice crackled with strain as he pulled his Hornet through a series of barrel rolls to defeat an incoming R-77 missile. "These guys aren't playing around." Sarah reversed hard left and found herself in a turning fight with Petrov's lead element, both aircraft pulling maximum Gs as they spiraled downward through the cloud deck. Her Hornet was more agile than the larger Su-30, but Petrov was flying with the confidence of someone who knew these waters intimately and had backup arriving by the minute. "Overlord, Phoenix, we are heavily engaged with Russian fighters. Whatever they're protecting down here is worth dying for. Recommend immediate alert launch of additional aircraft." Captain Webb's response carried the weight of decisions that could reshape international relations. "Phoenix, Alpha Strike is launching now, but they're 20 minutes out. You need to hold on until then." 20 minutes. Sarah checked her fuel gauge and felt her stomach drop. Between the afterburner usage and the defensive maneuvering, she was burning through JP5 at a rate that would leave her on fumes long before help arrived. Worse, the electronic jamming had resumed, creating a fog of interference that made it impossible to get precise targeting solutions on the remaining Russian fighters. "Hammer, what's your fuel state?" 3,000 pounds and dropping fast. "Phoenix, we need to start thinking about getting out of here." Sarah looked at her moving map display and realized the bitter truth of their tactical situation. The Russians had maneuvered them northeast, away from the carrier, and dangerously close to their territorial waters. Every minute of combat was another minute closer to a violation that could spark an international incident, or provide Moscow with the justification they needed for whatever they were building beneath the clouds. Through a gap in the overcast, she caught another glimpse of the surface activity below. What she'd initially taken for drilling platforms now revealed themselves as something far more sophisticated. Modular structures being assembled by heavy-lift vessels, connected by what looked like underwater cables stretching toward the Russian coastline. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of personnel working around the clock to install equipment that could only have one purpose. They're building a listening post, she realized, keying her radio to Hammer. Right on the edge of international waters, close enough to monitor all North Atlantic shipping lanes. The implications hit her like a physical blow. A Russian surveillance station in this location could track every submarine, every surface ship, every aircraft movement between North America and Europe. It would give Moscow the intelligence advantage they'd been seeking since the end of the Cold War, and more importantly, it would be protected by their most advanced air defense systems and submarine patrols. "Phoenix, break right! Missile in the air!" Sarah yanked her stick hard over as another SAN-9 streaked up from the surface ships below. The missile passed close enough that she could see the Cyrillic markings on its airframe before it detonated harmlessly in a cloud of fragmentation that rattled her cockpit canopy. "Hammer, we need to get this intelligence back to the ship. I'm going to keep them busy while you make your run for home." "Negative, Phoenix. We go home together, or not at all." The loyalty in her wingman's voice reminded Sarah why she'd chosen naval aviation over any other career path. These weren't just fellow pilots, they were family, bound together by shared dangers and the absolute knowledge that when everything went wrong, the person flying next to you was the only thing standing between you and death. But family obligations couldn't change fuel consumption rates, or the tactical reality that 6 Russian fighters now had them bracketed between the surface-to-air missile sites and the territorial water boundary. Sarah needed a miracle, or at least the kind of calculated risk that would either save them both or kill them in the attempt. The miracle came in the form of weather. The storm front Lieutenant Sullivan had warned her about was moving faster than predicted, bringing with it the kind of visibility restrictions that could hide a fighter aircraft from both radar and visual detection. Sarah could see the wall of gray precipitation approaching from the west like a curtain being drawn across the ocean. "Hammer, follow me into that squall line. We'll use the weather to mask our withdrawal." Phoenix, flying into a North Atlantic storm system at low altitude, is just asking to auger in. Maybe, but staying out here with these surface-to-air missiles is definitely asking to get shot down. Sarah rolled inverted and dove toward the approaching storm front, Petrov's Su-30 following her down in a pursuit curve that would bring both aircraft dangerously close to the wavetops. Her radar altimeter showed less than 500 feet above the churning ocean surface, but the approaching rain squall promised the kind of electronic camouflage that might let them slip away from their pursuers. The first raindrops hit her canopy like bullets, instantly reducing visibility to less than half a mile. Sarah's heads-up display shifted to instrument flight configuration as the world outside her cockpit disappeared into a gray void of precipitation and sea spray. Behind her, she could hear the Russian fighters struggling to maintain contact as their radar systems fought against the electromagnetic chaos of the storm. "American aircraft, you cannot hide forever," Petrov transmitted, his voice now carrying a note of frustration. "We know these waters better than you do." Sarah didn't respond. Radio discipline in weather like this meant saving every bit of concentration for the business of staying airborne. Her Hornet bucked and rolled as it encountered wind shear that could tear the wings off a less robust aircraft, but the FA-18 had been designed for carrier operations in exactly these conditions. "Phoenix, I'm getting separation from the Russian fighters," Hammer reported. "Looks like they're not willing to follow us into this soup." Through brief breaks in the precipitation, Sarah could see why. The storm system was intensifying as it moved northeast, creating the kind of turbulence and icing conditions that made formation flying nearly impossible, even for experienced pilots. The Russians might know these waters, but they weren't carrier qualified. They hadn't spent hundreds of hours learning to fly in conditions that would keep land-based aircraft on the ground. "Overlord, Phoenix Flight. We are withdrawing from the engagement area under cover of weather. Estimate 20 minutes to your position." "Phoenix, Overlord copies. Alpha Strike is airborne and proceeding to provide cover for your recovery. Be advised, Russian surface units are increasing speed and heading in your direction." Sarah checked her fuel gauge one more time and felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in her stomach. 1,500 pounds remaining, enough for maybe 10 more minutes of flight time if she kept the throttles at minimum setting. The ford was still over 100 miles away, and the headwinds generated by the storm were going to make every mile a struggle against mathematics and physics. "Hammer, what's your fuel state looking like?" 1,200 pounds. Phoenix, we're going to be running on fumes by the time we get back to the ship. The grim arithmetic of carrier aviation had caught up with them. Even if they managed to evade the Russian fighters and surface-to-air missiles, they were now racing against fuel consumption in weather conditions that would make a normal carrier landing challenging for rested pilots with full tanks. As they climbed out of the storm system's lower levels, Sarah got her first clear look at what they were flying toward. The Ford's distinctive silhouette was visible on the horizon, but between their current position and the carrier lay a gauntlet of Russian surface ships that had positioned themselves to intercept any American aircraft trying to return home. Overlord Phoenix, I'm showing multiple surface contacts between our position and the ship. Recommend vector for approach that avoids hostile units. Phoenix, all approaches are currently blocked by Russian naval vessels. Alpha Strike is engaging targets of opportunity to clear you a path home. Through her HUD, Sarah could see the white contrails of missiles being exchanged between American and Russian forces, the opening moves of what could become the first naval battle between superpowers since World War II. The intelligence she'd gathered about the Russian listening post was important enough that both sides were willing to risk everything to either protect it or expose it. Hammer, we're going straight through the middle. Stay tight on my wing and don't deviate for anything. Phoenix, that's insane. We'll be flying directly over their surface-to-air missile sites. Maybe, but we'll be flying fast and low, and they'll be dealing with our strike aircraft at the same time. Sometimes the direct approach is the one nobody expects. Sarah pushed her throttles forward and descended to wave-top height, her Hornet screaming across the North Atlantic at just under the speed of sound. The Russian destroyer captains would have seconds to react to her approach, and in those few crucial moments, she was betting that confusion and overlapping fields of fire would work in her favor. The bet paid off in spectacular fashion. As she flashed between two Russian frigates, at an altitude of less than 200 feet, their surface-to-air missile systems engaged multiple targets simultaneously, including each other. Sarah's radar warning receiver painted a Christmas tree of missile launches and radar locks, but the majority of the weapons were flying toward the higher-altitude Alpha Strike aircraft rather than her sea-skimming approach. "Phoenix, I've got the ship in sight!" Hammer called out, his voice carrying the first hint of relief she'd heard since their engagement began. The Ford's flight deck appeared through the haze like a vision of salvation, 600 feet of pitching steel that represented the difference between completing their mission and becoming footnotes in aviation history. But, as Sarah lined up for her approach, she realized that surviving the Russian fighters and surface-to-air missiles had been the easy part of their ordeal. Landing a fighter aircraft on a carrier deck required precise coordination between pilot, aircraft, and ship. It demanded steady nerves, perfect timing, and enough fuel to execute a safe approach. As Sarah's fuel gauge dropped below 500 pounds, less than 5 minutes of flying time, she realized she was about to attempt the most difficult carrier landing of her career, with almost empty tanks in weather conditions that had grounded civilian aviation across 3 countries. "Phoenix, you're cleared for straight-in approach," came the voice of Rodriguez from the landing signal officer platform. "Winds 45 knots gusting to 60, deck pitching 15 degrees. We'll take you aboard on the first pass." There wouldn't be a second pass. Sarah's fuel state meant this approach would either end with her Hornet safely chained to the deck, or with her and Hammer ejecting into the North Atlantic and hoping the rescue helicopters could find them before hypothermia set in. As the Ford's stern approached through the rain and spray, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came with accepting that some things were beyond her control. She'd done everything possible to gather the intelligence, evade the Russian fighters, and get her wingman home safely. The rest was up to physics, weather, and the skills she'd developed over hundreds of previous carrier landings. "Phoenix, you're on center line and on glide slope," Rodriguez called out, looking good all the way down. The carrier deck rushed up to meet her through the storm, and Sarah prepared to find out whether her reputation for lucky landings would hold true when it mattered most. We're deep into this incredible story now, and I hope you're as captivated as I am by these unfolding events. The amount of effort that goes into researching, writing, and narrating these novel-length stories is immense. We're talking about creating content equivalent to a published book, but it's worth it to bring you stories that truly engage and transport you to another world. If you're enjoying this journey so far, please take a second to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate great storytelling. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating these detailed, epic narratives. We still have so much more to discover together, so let's see how this situation unfolds. Sarah's Hornet touched down on the Ford's deck with the controlled violence of 30 tons of aircraft meeting 600 feet of pitching steel at 140 knots. The number 3 wire caught her tailhook perfectly, and the sudden deceleration threw her forward against her harness as her engines spooled down from flight idle to ground idle. Through her rain-streaked canopy, she could see deck crew already running toward her aircraft, their yellow jerseys bright against the gray morning as they prepared to quickly taxi her clear of the landing area. "Phoenix, welcome aboard," came Captain Webb's voice from primary flight control. But instead of the usual post-flight pleasantries, his tone carried an urgency that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Report to Combat Information Center immediately upon shutdown. Do not debrief with Squadron Intelligence first." As Sarah climbed down from her cockpit, Chief Martinez was already conducting his post-flight inspection with the kind of intense focus that meant something was seriously wrong. Bullet holes stitched across her Hornet's vertical stabilizer told the story of how close she'd come to not making it home, while heat scoring on her exhaust nozzles indicated she'd pushed the engines harder than they were designed to handle. "Phoenix, you used up about 3 of your 9 lives on this one," Martinez said, running his hand along a line of metal fatigue cracks near the wing root. "Whatever you saw out there, I hope it was worth nearly losing a $35 million aircraft." "Chief, I think it was worth a lot more than that," Sarah replied, pulling off her helmet and running fingers through sweat-dampened hair. Around them on the flight deck, the controlled chaos of recovery operations continued as the Alpha Strike aircraft returned from their engagement with the Russian forces. She could see ordnance crews already rearming the fighters for potential follow-up missions, while medical personnel stood by with stretchers in case any of the returning pilots had been wounded in combat. Hammer's Hornet trapped aboard 30 seconds behind her, his aircraft showing similar battle damage and the telltale signs of an engine that had been pushed beyond its normal operating parameters. As he climbed down from his cockpit, Sarah could see the strain of the last hour etched on his face, the kind of exhaustion that came from flying at the absolute limits of human endurance, while making life-or-death decisions every few seconds. "Phoenix, Hammer," he called out as they walked toward the island superstructure together. "Next time you decide to take on the entire Russian Air Force, give me a heads up so I can write a will first." "Hammer, something tells me we're just getting started. Whatever they're building out there, they were willing to shoot down American aircraft to protect it. That means Moscow considers this operation worth risking war over." The Combat Information Center was a study in controlled chaos when Sarah and Hammer arrived 5 minutes later. Banks of radar screens painted the tactical picture across hundreds of square miles of ocean, while intelligence specialists analyzed the data streaming in from satellites, underwater sensors, and the reconnaissance pods from their recent mission. Captain Webb stood at the center of it all, his weathered face grim as he studied the latest intelligence reports. "Phoenix, Hammer, what you two stumbled into out there has changed everything," Webb began without preamble. "The photographs from your reconnaissance pod show a Russian installation that violates at least 6 international treaties and poses a direct threat to NATO shipping lanes." On the main display screen, high-resolution images showed the modular structures Sarah had glimpsed through the clouds, but the level of detail visible in the photographs revealed the true scope of what the Russians were building. Massive underwater sensor arrays connected by fiber-optic cables, surface platforms bristling with electronic warfare equipment, and what appeared to be vertical launch tubes for missiles that could reach targets anywhere in the North Atlantic. "Sir, how long have they been building this?" Sarah asked, studying the images with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing enemy installations. "Based on satellite imagery analysis, we estimate construction began approximately 6 months ago," replied Commander Lisa Park, the Ford's intelligence officer. "But they've been very clever about it, building components in Russian shipyards and assembling them on-site during periods of bad weather when our satellites couldn't get clear images." Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, a test of American response times and capabilities while the Russians prepared for this installation. "Ma'am, what kind of capabilities are we looking at?" Hammer asked, his pilot's mind already calculating the tactical implications. "Worst-case scenario? They could monitor and potentially intercept every communication between North America and Europe. They could track submarine movements throughout the GIUK gap, and they have the missile capacity to threaten any surface ship within a 1,000-mile radius." The Greenland-Iceland-UK gap was NATO's most critical choke point for controlling access between the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans. Russian control of surveillance assets in that area would effectively give Moscow the ability to strangle Western naval operations in both theaters simultaneously. Captain Webb turned to address the entire CIC crew. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're dealing with here is a potential game-changer for the strategic balance in the North Atlantic. The President has been briefed, NATO command is scrambling to assess the threat, and we've been ordered to maintain constant surveillance of the installation until further notice. Sir, Sarah interjected, the Russians made it clear they're willing to use force to protect whatever they're building. Flying additional reconnaissance missions is going to mean air-to-air combat every time we get close. Phoenix, that's exactly why I need my best pilots leading those missions. Your performance today proved you can handle whatever the Russians throw at you. But more importantly, you've seen their capabilities firsthand. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical force. She was being asked to not just fly dangerous missions, but to lead other pilots into combat situations that could escalate into full-scale war between nuclear powers. The stakes couldn't possibly be higher, and yet she found herself nodding acceptance before her rational mind had time to object. Sir, I'll need a full intelligence briefing on Russian air tactics and the latest electronic warfare capabilities of their surface ships. If we're going back out there, I want to know everything about what we're up against. Quote. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah immersed herself in a crash course on Russian military capabilities that would have been classified beyond her clearance level just 24 hours earlier. She learned about new missile systems that could engage targets at ranges previously thought impossible, electronic warfare equipment that could blind American sensors from hundreds of miles away, and submarine capabilities that made the Russian boats nearly invisible to conventional detection methods. More troubling was what she learned about the installation itself. Intelligence analysts believed the structures were designed to be rapidly expandable, suggesting that what they'd photographed was just the first phase of a much larger project. If completed according to apparent specifications, the Russian facility could effectively control maritime traffic throughout the North Atlantic, while providing Moscow with real-time intelligence on NATO military movements. Phoenix, Commander Park said during a break in the briefings, there's something else you need to know. We've intercepted communications suggesting that the Russians are accelerating their construction timeline. Whatever you saw today, they're working around the clock to make it operational. How long do we have? Best estimate? 72 hours before the first phase becomes fully operational. After that, any attempt to interfere with the installation would require a major military operation that neither side really wants. Sarah felt the familiar knot of tension form in her stomach. 72 hours meant that any decisive action would have to happen within the next 3 days, and the only way to gather the intelligence needed for such action was through additional reconnaissance flights into increasingly hostile airspace. That evening, as Sarah sat in the ready room reviewing mission plans for the next day's flights, she was approached by Lieutenant Commander Mark Razor Hendricks, one of the squadron's most experienced pilots. Razor had been flying off carriers for 15 years, accumulating over 2,000 hours of combat time across multiple deployments, and his opinion carried weight with both junior pilots and senior leadership. Phoenix, word around the squadron is that you volunteered us for a suicide mission, Razor said, settling into the chair beside her. Want to explain why we're picking a fight with the Russian Navy over some listening post? Quote. Sarah looked up from her charts and met Razor's steady gaze. She'd known this conversation was coming. Experienced pilots didn't blindly follow orders into combat without understanding the larger strategic picture, especially when those missions involve significant risk of not coming home. Razor, what would you do if you discovered that the enemy was building something that could fundamentally change the balance of power in our area of operations? I'd want to know why it was worth dying for. Sarah spread out the reconnaissance photographs on the table between them, pointing to the various components of the Russian installation. This isn't just a listening post. It's a naval fortress that could control shipping throughout the North Atlantic. Every cargo vessel carrying supplies to Europe, every military transport, every submarine transit. Moscow would know about it in real time. Razor studied the images with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years targeting enemy installations. His expression gradually shifted from skepticism to understanding as he grasped the scope of what the Russians were building. Jesus, Phoenix. If they get this thing operational, they could strangle NATO logistics in a matter of weeks. Exactly, and that's assuming they stop with surveillance capabilities. Those vertical launch tubes could accommodate missiles with enough range to threaten targets from Iceland to Spain. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Morrison, who looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 8 hours. His normally crisp uniform was wrinkled, and the lines around his eyes suggested he'd been dealing with pressure from sources well above the squadron level. "Phoenix, Razor, we've got new orders from COMLANTFLT, Morrison announced, referring to Commander, U.S. Fleet Forces Command. "Tomorrow's mission has been upgraded to a strike reconnaissance. We're not just photographing the installation. We're authorized to engage any Russian military assets that pose a direct threat to our aircraft." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Strike reconnaissance meant they'd be carrying live weapons and operating under rules of engagement that gave them significant latitude to defend themselves. It also meant that the political leadership had decided the intelligence value was worth the risk of a shooting war. "Sir, what's our target priority?" Razor asked. "Primary mission is still intelligence gathering, but if you encounter active electronic warfare systems or surface-to-air missile sites, you're cleared to engage. Secondary targets include any submarines operating on the surface and command and control facilities." Morrison spread out a detailed tactical map showing the planned approach routes and target areas. "Phoenix, you'll be leading a 4-ship formation. Razor will be your section leader for the second element. Weather forecast shows clear skies and minimal winds. Good for photography, but bad for concealment." "Sir, what's our rules of engagement if we encounter Russian fighters?" "Defend yourselves, but don't pursue targets across the territorial boundary. Washington wants this to look like a defensive action, not an American first strike." As Morrison briefed them on the tactical details of the next day's mission, Sarah realized that her reputation for lucky landings was about to be tested in an entirely new context. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be trying to land safely on a carrier deck, she'd be trying to prevent or start a war, depending on how well she executed the most dangerous mission of her career. The briefing concluded with intelligence updates on Russian force dispositions and the latest satellite imagery of the installation. Construction was proceeding faster than anyone had predicted, with new modules being installed even as they spoke. The Russians were clearly racing against time, suggesting they knew about American surveillance and were trying to present NATO with a fait accompli before any countermeasures could be organized. "Phoenix," Morrison said as the other pilots filed out of the ready room, "I need to ask you something off the record. Are you certain about what you saw out there today? Because based on your reconnaissance data, we're about to commit acts of war against the Russian Federation." Sarah met her commanding officer's gaze without hesitation. "Sir, I'm certain. Whatever they're building is worth everything they're putting into defending it, and everything we're risking to stop it." "Good enough for me. Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." As Sarah made her way through the Ford's corridors toward her stateroom, she passed groups of sailors and airmen preparing for what everyone understood could be the beginning of a larger conflict. Weapons were being loaded, aircraft systems checked and rechecked, and emergency procedures reviewed. The entire ship hummed with the tension of thousands of people preparing for battle, while hoping it wouldn't come to that. In her small stateroom, Sarah sat on her narrow bunk and tried to process everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Just yesterday, she'd been a naval aviator with a reputation for surviving difficult situations. Now she was potentially one of the key figures in preventing, or precipitating, the first major military confrontation between superpowers in decades. Her phone buzzed with a message from her sister Jessica, a civilian contractor working in aerospace engineering in San Diego. The message was brief but pointed. "Seeing some disturbing news reports about military tensions in the Atlantic. Are you okay?" Sarah stared at the message for several minutes before composing her reply. "Can't discuss operational details, but yes, I'm safe. Take care of yourself." It was a lie, of course. She wasn't safe, and depending on how tomorrow's mission went, she might not be safe for the foreseeable future. But families of military personnel learned to live with that kind of uncertainty, just as the military personnel themselves learned to compartmentalize the risks and focus on the mission. As she lay in her bunk listening to the steady thrum of the Ford's engines and the distant sounds of flight deck operations, Sarah tried to imagine what the next day would bring. Best-case scenario, they'd gather the intelligence needed for NATO to take appropriate diplomatic and military action. Worst-case scenario, they'd start a shooting war that could escalate beyond anyone's ability to control. Either way, her reputation for lucky landings was about to face its ultimate test. The alarm jolted Sarah awake at 0400, 2 hours before her scheduled brief time, but the urgent tone told her something had changed during the night. She rolled out of her bunk and reached for her flight suit, muscle memory guiding her through the familiar routine while her mind struggled to shake off the fog of too little sleep. The passageways of the Ford buzzed with activity that suggested the entire ship had been awakened early. Sailors moved with a purposeful urgency that meant the situation had escalated beyond routine military operations, and the announcements over the ship's communication system carried the crisp authority of General Quarters preparations. "Phoenix, report to Combat Information Center immediately," came the voice of the officer of the deck over her stateroom speaker system. "This is not a drill." Sarah's stomach dropped as she recognized the implications. Non-drill emergency calls at 0400 meant that the geopolitical situation had deteriorated significantly while she slept, and her expertise was needed to interpret developments that could affect American military operations throughout the Atlantic. The Combat Information Center was a hive of controlled chaos when she arrived 5 minutes later. Additional intelligence specialists had been called in during the night, and the main display screens showed a tactical picture that made her blood run cold. Red symbols indicating hostile military units now covered vast areas of the North Atlantic, while blue symbols representing NATO forces appeared vastly outnumbered by comparison. "Phoenix, thank God you're here," Captain Webb said without preamble. "We've had significant developments overnight. Russian submarines have been detected moving into attack positions throughout the GIUK gap, and their surface fleet has deployed in a pattern that suggests they're preparing for major combat operations." On the central display, Sarah could see the scope of Russian naval deployment. Dozens of submarines had emerged from their bases along the Kola Peninsula, while surface action groups positioned themselves to control key shipping lanes between North America and Europe. Most ominously, their ballistic missile submarines had departed their protective bastions and moved into launch positions that could threaten targets throughout NATO territory. "Sir, what triggered this escalation?" Sarah asked, studying the tactical display with growing concern. At 0130 local time, a Russian Akula-class attack submarine attempted to place listening devices on the underwater cables connecting the Azores to Newfoundland, Commander Park replied. USS Hartford detected the operation and ordered the submarine to withdraw. The Russian captain refused and threatened to torpedo Hartford if she interfered. Sarah felt ice form in her veins. Underwater communication cables carried the majority of internet traffic and financial data between continents. Russian interference with those cables could cripple Western economies within hours, while also providing Moscow with access to vast amounts of intelligence data. Did Hartford engage? Quote, "Negative, but the standoff lasted 3 hours before the Russian submarine withdrew. During that time, Moscow moved their entire northern fleet to advanced positions and declared a 200-mile exclusion zone around the installation you photographed yesterday." The implications cascaded through Sarah's mind like dominoes falling. A 200-mile exclusion zone would encompass significant portions of international waters and international shipping lanes. If Russia was willing to enforce such a zone with military action, they were essentially declaring war on the principle of freedom of navigation that had governed maritime operations since the end of World War II. "Sir, what are our orders?" Captain Webb's expression was grim as he responded. "We've been directed to conduct immediate reconnaissance of all Russian positions within 500 miles of our current location. But here's the critical part. We're authorized to engage any Russian unit that attempts to interfere with freedom of navigation in international waters." Sarah understood the significance immediately. The rules of engagement had shifted from defensive to potentially offensive, giving American commanders the authority to initiate combat if they determined that Russian actions threatened vital Western interests. It was the kind of escalation that could lead to full-scale war within hours if not carefully managed. "Phoenix," Webb continued, "your mission today has been expanded. You'll be leading an 8-ship strike package to photograph the Russian installation and assess their current defensive capabilities, but you're also tasked with ensuring that international shipping lanes remain open." "Sir, that sounds like we're being asked to start a war." "No, Phoenix. We're being asked to prevent one. If the Russians succeed in establishing control over North Atlantic shipping lanes, they'll have achieved their strategic objectives without firing a shot. Our job is to demonstrate that America and NATO won't allow that to happen." The briefing that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in 10 years of naval aviation. Instead of targeting individual installations or conducting limited reconnaissance, they were being asked to execute a mission that could determine the balance of power in the Atlantic for the next several decades. The intelligence picture showed Russian forces deploying in patterns that suggested they intended to enforce their exclusion zone with overwhelming military force. Phoenix, your strike package will consist of 4 F/A-18 Super Hornets and 4 F-35C Lightning IIs, Commander Morrison announced as he joined the briefing. The F-35s will provide electronic warfare support and advanced targeting, while your Hornets will carry the primary reconnaissance equipment and air-to-air weapons. Sarah studied the mission parameters and felt her tactical instincts beginning to process the complexity of what they were being asked to accomplish. 8 aircraft against potentially dozens of Russian fighters, supported by surface-to-air missile systems and submarine-launched weapons that could engage targets at ranges exceeding 100 miles. Sir, what's our backup plan if we encounter overwhelming opposition? USS Leyte Gulf is moving to a position 50 miles southwest of the target area with a full load of Tomahawk cruise missiles. If your reconnaissance confirms that the Russian installation poses an immediate threat to NATO interests, she's authorized to engage with precision strikes. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again, but this time with a gravity that made her previous missions seem simple by comparison. The intelligence she gathered could determine whether the United States launched missile strikes against Russian military installations, the kind of action that could escalate to nuclear exchange within hours. Commander Morrison, she said, I need to know the exact parameters for determining whether the installation poses an immediate threat, because once we cross that line, there's no going back. Morrison's expression was as serious as she'd ever seen it. Phoenix, you're authorized to recommend strike action if you observe any of the following: active missile systems capable of engaging shipping, electronic warfare equipment jamming NATO communications, or submarine pens that could support extended operations against Western targets. Every one of those criteria would almost certainly be met by any military installation the Russians were building in that location. Sarah realized she was being asked to make decisions that could reshape international relations for generations, based on her interpretation of intelligence gathered while flying at high speed through hostile airspace. Sir, request permission to speak with the pilots who will be flying this mission before we launch. Granted. Brief them on anything you think they need to know, but remember, this mission is classified at the highest levels. Nothing we've discussed leaves this room. An hour later, Sarah found herself in the squadron-ready room, addressing 7 of the most experienced naval aviators on the Ford. The faces looking back at her represented hundreds of combat missions and thousands of hours of flying time, but even these veteran pilots seemed sobered by the magnitude of what they were being asked to undertake. Gentlemen, what we're about to do has the potential to either prevent a war or start one, Sarah began, her voice carrying the authority that came with having already faced Russian fighters and lived to tell about it. The intelligence we gather in the next few hours could determine American military policy for years to come. Lieutenant Commander Snake Williams, one of the F-35 pilots, raised his hand. Phoenix, what's the realistic probability that we'll encounter organized opposition? Based on yesterday's experience, I'd say 100%. The Russians have moved their best pilots and most advanced aircraft to defend this installation. They're not going to let us photograph it without a fight. And if we encounter submarine-launched surface-to-air missiles? Sarah paused before answering, recognizing that honesty was more important than morale at this point. Snake, we'll be flying through the most heavily defended airspace outside of Moscow itself. Some of us might not come home. But if we don't gather this intelligence, the alternative could be a shooting war that kills millions of people. The room fell silent as the pilots absorbed the implications of her words. These were professionals who'd accepted the risks of carrier aviation, but they were also human beings with families and futures that could be cut short by decisions made in the next few hours. Phoenix, Razor spoke up from the back of the room, what do you need from us? I need you to fly better than you've ever flown before. I need you to follow orders without hesitation, even if those orders seem to put us in impossible situations. And I need you to trust that the intelligence we're gathering is worth the risks we're taking. The mission brief that followed covered every aspect of their planned operation, from takeoff procedures to emergency recovery options. But the most critical discussion focused on the rules of engagement and the criteria for recommending military action against the Russian installation. Remember, Sarah emphasized, We're not just gathering intelligence for our own military commanders. NATO allies are depending on our assessment to make their own decisions about how to respond to Russian actions. What we see and report today could determine whether Europe stands with America or tries to negotiate separate peace agreements with Moscow. As the briefing concluded and the pilots began their individual mission preparations, Sarah was approached by Captain Webb, who'd observed the entire session from the back of the room. "Phoenix, I wanted you to know that COMLANTFLT specifically requested you to lead this mission. Your performance yesterday convinced them that you have the tactical judgment needed for this kind of operation." "Sir, I appreciate the confidence, but I hope they understand that tactical judgment only goes so far when you're outnumbered 8-1. Phoenix, the odds were never the point. The point is gathering intelligence. That gives our political leadership the information they need to make informed decisions about war and peace." As Sarah walked toward her aircraft 2 hours later, the Ford's flight deck was a study in controlled preparation for potential combat. Ordnance crews loaded weapons that could engage targets from air-to-air missiles to precision-guided bombs, while maintenance personnel conducted final inspections with the understanding that mechanical failures could have strategic consequences. Her F/A-18 Super Hornet sat on catapult number 1, armed with 6 AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles and equipped with the most advanced reconnaissance pod in the Navy's inventory. Chief Martinez conducted his pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the aircraft's performance could determine the outcome of international crises. "Phoenix, she's ready for whatever you're going to ask her to do," Martinez reported. "All systems are green, full fuel load, and every sensor has been calibrated for maximum performance." As Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence, she realized that her reputation for lucky landings was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. Today, she wouldn't just be trying to survive combat and land safely on a carrier deck. She'd be trying to prevent a war while gathering intelligence that could change the course of history. The catapult launch that followed was like being fired from a cannon into the most dangerous airspace on Earth. The 8-ship formation climbed through 10,000 feet into skies that looked deceptively peaceful for airspace that could become a war zone within minutes. Sarah's tactical display showed her strike package spread in combat formation, the 4 F-35C Lightning IIs, taking positions that would allow them to provide electronic warfare support while remaining difficult for Russian radar systems to detect and track. "Phoenix Flight, you are cleared to mission frequency," the Ford's departure controller radioed. "Contact Overlord on 251.5. Good hunting." "Phoenix Flight, switching to tactical," Sarah acknowledged, changing to the encrypted frequency that would keep them in contact with the Ford's Combat Information Center throughout what could become the most dangerous reconnaissance mission since the Cold War. As they passed through 15,000 feet, the electronic environment began showing signs of the sophisticated jamming systems that protected the Russian installation. Sarah's radar warning receiver painted a complex picture of overlapping defensive systems designed to detect, track, and engage aircraft at ranges that would have been impossible just a decade earlier. "Overlord, Phoenix Flight checking in with 8 aircraft, proceeding to Point Alpha," Sarah transmitted. "Electronic interference is significant and increasing." "Phoenix Overlord copies. Be advised we're tracking multiple Russian air patrols in your operating area. Latest count shows 12 fighters airborne, with additional aircraft launching from Kola Peninsula bases." 12 fighters. Sarah did the tactical mathematics in her head and didn't like the results. Even with the advanced capabilities of the F-35s, her formation was still outnumbered significantly by pilots who knew this airspace intimately and were fighting to protect what Moscow considered a vital strategic installation. "Snake, what are you seeing on the electronic warfare displays?" Sarah asked Lieutenant Commander Williams, whose F-35C carried the most sophisticated sensors in their formation. "Phoenix, I'm picking up at least 6 different radar systems, including some signatures I don't recognize. Looks like the Russians have deployed equipment that's more advanced than our intelligence estimates predicted." Unknown radar systems meant unknown capabilities, which in turn meant unknown threats that could engage her aircraft without warning. Sarah felt the familiar knot of tension form in her stomach as she realized they were flying into an environment where the enemy's capabilities exceeded their own intelligence preparation. "All aircraft, Phoenix, tighten up the formation and prepare for electronic countermeasures. We're about to find out how good Russian technology really is." As they approached the target area, Sarah's first visual contact with the Russian installation made her breath catch in her throat. What had appeared to be a modest construction project in yesterday's photographs had transformed overnight into a sprawling complex of interconnected platforms, underwater sensor arrays, and defensive systems that could have been lifted from a science fiction movie. Overlord Phoenix. Visual contact with target area. The installation is significantly larger than intelligence estimates indicated, uploading reconnaissance data now. Through her HUD, Sarah could see construction vessels working around the clock to complete what appeared to be a massive underwater listening post connected to surface platforms bristling with communication equipment and defensive weapons. The scale of the operation was staggering. Hundreds of personnel working with the kind of urgency that suggested they knew their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "Phoenix, I'm getting multiple missile lock-on signals," Snake reported, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who just realized their reconnaissance mission had become a survival exercise. "Count 8 SAN-9 systems active and tracking." Sarah's radar warning receiver erupted in a cacophony of audio alerts, as surface-to-air missile systems across the installation achieved lock-on solutions for every aircraft in her formation. The mathematical reality of their situation hit her like a physical blow. They were flying through the engagement zone of more anti-aircraft weapons than NATO had faced since World War II. "All aircraft, Phoenix, deploy electronic countermeasures and prepare for defensive maneuvers. Do not cross the territorial boundary." The first missiles launched 60 seconds later, streaking up from the Russian installation like deadly fireworks. Sarah's training took over as she rolled her Hornet into a defensive spiral, deploying chaff and flare to confuse the incoming weapons, while maintaining enough stability to continue photographing the target area below. "Phoenix, missiles in the air," Hammer called out from his position as her wingman. "Count 8 SAN-9s inbound." The next 2 minutes unfolded in the deadly choreography of modern air combat. Sarah's formation split into defensive pairs, each pilot using every electronic countermeasure and evasive maneuver in their repertoire to defeat incoming missiles that could destroy a fighter aircraft with a single hit. Chaff bloomed across the sky like metallic flowers, while flares created false heat signatures designed to seduce infrared-guided weapons away from their intended targets. Fox 3, Snake transmitted as he launched an AGM-88 HARM missile at one of the surface-to-air missile sites. The high-speed anti-radiation missile streaked toward its target with the relentless precision of guided physics, detonating against a radar antenna in a flash of light visible even through the electronic chaos of combat. But destroying one radar site only revealed the true scope of Russian defensive preparations. As Sarah pulled out of her defensive spiral and reacquired the target area, her tactical display showed missile launch signatures from positions that hadn't been visible in the initial intelligence estimates. The Russians had constructed a layered defense system that could engage aircraft at multiple altitudes and ranges simultaneously. "Overlord Phoenix! We are heavily engaged by surface-to-air missiles. Installation is more heavily defended than intelligence predicted. Uploading battle damage assessment now." As her aircraft's computer transmitted real-time combat footage back to the Ford, Sarah realized they had discovered something that would fundamentally change NATO's understanding of Russian military capabilities. "Phoenix, multiple air contacts bearing 040, range 40 miles and closing fast," reported Lieutenant Voodoo Jackson, whose F-35C provided early warning for the formation. "Count shows 16 Russian fighters, mixed Su-30s and MiG-35s. 16 fighters." Sarah's tactical mind processed the numbers and realized they were about to face the largest air-to-air engagement involving American forces since the Gulf War. But unlike previous conflicts, this battle would be fought against opponents with technology and training that matched or exceeded their own capabilities. "All aircraft, Phoenix. We have 16 bandits inbound from the northeast. Weapons free. Engage only in self-defense. And remember, do not cross the territorial boundary under any circumstances." The merge happened at 25,000 feet, with a combined closing speed that compressed tactical decision-making into fractions of seconds. Sarah's formation split according to predetermined battle plans, with the F-35s using their stealth capabilities to achieve first-shot opportunities while the Super Hornets provided mutual support and engaged targets of opportunity. "Fox 3, Sarah called out as she launched her first AMRAAM at a Su-30 that had committed to a head-on attack. The missile's rocket motor ignited in a streak of white fire, arcing through the morning sky toward a target whose pilot was simultaneously launching his own weapon at her aircraft. The next 30 seconds tested every skill Sarah had developed over 10 years of naval aviation. She defeated an incoming R-77 missile through a combination of chaff deployment and a vertical climb that pulled 8 gigaseconds before rolling inverted and diving back toward the ocean surface. Behind her, the Russian missile detonated harmlessly in a cloud of fragmentation, but her own AMRAAM found its mark with a flash that lit up the northern horizon. "Phoenix, I'm defensive," Hammer transmitted as he engaged a MiG-35 in a turning fight that spiraled down through 15,000 feet. This guy knows what he's doing. Around them, the sky filled with the white contrails of missiles seeking targets, and the black smoke of aircraft that had found their limits. Sarah's tactical display showed a confused melee of friendly and hostile contacts, with aircraft engaging at ranges and speeds that made positive identification challenging even with the most advanced sensors. "Snake, status report," Sarah called out as she maneuvered to support Hammer's engagement. "Phoenix, I'm Winchester on AMRAAMs, but still mission capable. Voodoo took a hit, but he's still flying. We've splashed 4 bandits confirmed, but they keep coming." 4 confirmed kills against 16 attackers meant the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah's fuel gauge showed 1,500 pounds remaining, enough for maybe 10 more minutes if she kept throttles at minimum setting. "Overlord Phoenix, we need immediate support. We are heavily engaged and running low on fuel and ammunition." "Phoenix, Alpha Strike is launching now, but they're 25 minutes out. You need to break contact and return to base." 25 minutes. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge and realized they didn't have 25 minutes of flight time remaining, especially if they had to continue defensive maneuvering against Russian fighters that showed no signs of disengaging from combat. "All aircraft, Phoenix, we're Winchester on missiles and Bingo on fuel. Time to go home." But as Sarah turned her formation toward the Ford's position, she discovered that the Russians had anticipated their withdrawal route. 6 fresh fighters had positioned themselves between her aircraft and the carrier, while surface ships moved to block the most direct escape route with overlapping fields of surface-to-air missile coverage. "Phoenix, we've got a problem," Razor transmitted from his position as leader of the second element. "They've boxed us in. Every escape route is covered by SAMs or fighters." Sarah studied her tactical display and felt despair settling in her stomach like ice water. The Russians had executed a textbook intercept operation, using their numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of local geography to trap her formation in a tactical box that offered no easy escape routes. "Overlord Phoenix, we are trapped by Russian forces and running critically low on fuel. Recommend immediate strike on installation to create diversion for our withdrawal." The response from Captain Webb carried the weight of decisions that could reshape international relations. "Phoenix, strike authorization has been denied by Washington. You are ordered to withdraw without engaging Russian territorial waters or airspace." Sarah felt the bitter irony of their situation. They'd gathered intelligence proving that Russia was building a military installation that violated international law and threatened NATO security interests. But political considerations prevented them from taking action that could save her pilots' lives. "All aircraft, Phoenix, we're going to have to punch through their defensive line. Stay together, watch your fuel consumption, and prepare for the fight of your lives." Quote. As Sarah pushed her throttles into afterburner and dove toward the gap between 2 Russian destroyers, she realized, today, luck wouldn't be enough. It would take skill, courage, and the kind of teamwork that could only be forged in the crucible of combat. The next few minutes would determine whether she and her pilots made it home to report what they'd discovered, or whether they became the first casualties of a war that neither side officially wanted to fight. We're approaching the climactic moments of this epic tale, and the tension is at its peak. Creating stories of this scope and detail requires not just writing talent, but careful plotting, character development, and attention to every narrative thread. We've journeyed through nearly 40,000 words together, and I hope every moment has kept you engaged. If this story has drawn you in and kept you listening, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Share this epic with anyone who loves immersive storytelling, and hit that notification bell for more incredible adventures. Now, let's witness how everything comes together in these final, crucial moments. Sarah's Hornet screamed through the gap between 2 Russian destroyers at less than 200 feet above the wavetops, her afterburners painting twin trails of fire across the gray North Atlantic morning. Behind her, 7 other American fighters followed in loose formation, each pilot calculating fuel consumption rates against the distance to the ford, while Russian surface-to-air missiles tracked their every movement. "Phoenix, I've got multiple missile launches from the surface ships," Voodoo called out, his voice tight with the strain of pulling maximum Gs while his damaged F-35C struggled to maintain formation integrity. "Count 8. No, 12 SAN-9s in the air." Sarah's radar warning receiver erupted in a symphony of threat alerts as every Russian ship in the area achieved firing solutions on her formation. The mathematical reality was stark. 12 missiles against 8 aircraft meant that perfect execution would still result in American casualties, and perfect execution was never guaranteed in combat conditions this chaotic. "All aircraft, Phoenix. Split formation, maximum defensive spread. Use the surface clutter to mask your radar signatures." Sarah rolled her Hornet hard right and dove until her radar altimeter showed less than 50 feet above the churning ocean surface. At this altitude, the curvature of the Earth would help mask her aircraft from Russian radar systems, but it also meant flying in the zone where a single moment of inattention could send $35 million of fighter aircraft into the sea at 600 miles per hour. The first wave of missiles streaked overhead like deadly meteors, their proximity fuzzes detonating when they lost lock on the American aircraft skimming through the surface clutter. Sarah felt the concussions from the explosions buffet her Hornet as she maintained course toward the ford's last known position, now over 80 miles away and seemingly impossibly distant given their fuel situation. "Phoenix, Snake here. I'm showing critical fuel, less than 800 pounds remaining. We need to find the ship fast." 800 pounds represented maybe 4 minutes of flight time at military power, or 2 minutes with afterburner to evade additional missile attacks. Sarah checked her own fuel gauge and felt her stomach clench. 1,100 pounds, barely enough to reach the carrier under ideal conditions, and their current situation was anything but ideal. "Overlord, Phoenix flight. Emergency fuel state, request immediate recovery. We are running on fumes and still under attack by Russian forces." "Phoenix, Overlord. Ford is recovering aircraft as fast as possible, but we've got Russian submarines converging on our position. Captain Webb has ordered evasive maneuvers that will take us further from your current position." The tactical situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Russian submarines were forcing the Ford to maneuver away from Sarah's formation, while surface ships and fighters continued to pursue her aircraft toward what was beginning to look like a fuel exhaustion scenario that would end with 8 American pilots in life rafts. "Phoenix, multiple air contacts bearing 270, range 30 miles, Hammer reported. Looks like more Russian fighters trying to cut off our escape route." Sarah's tactical display painted a picture that would have been hopeless under normal circumstances. Russian forces were converging from multiple directions, while her own aircraft operated with critically low fuel states and diminished ammunition loads. But normal circumstances didn't account for the kind of desperate ingenuity that kept carrier pilots alive when everything went wrong simultaneously. "All aircraft, Phoenix. We're going to use the storm front to mask our approach to the ship. Follow me into the weather and maintain strict radio silence until we're within 10 miles of the ford." The storm system that had provided concealment during yesterday's engagement was moving northeast, creating a wall of precipitation and electrical activity that would blind Russian radar systems while providing cover for the American formation. But flying formation in weather conditions that grounded civilian aircraft required the kind of skill that came from hundreds of hours of carrier operations in the North Atlantic's worst conditions. "Phoenix, that storm system has winds gusting over 60 knots and severe turbulence," Voodoo transmitted, his voice carrying the strain of flying a battle-damaged aircraft. "My F-35 took shrapnel in the right engine. I'm not sure she'll hold together in that kind of weather." Sarah made the kind of split-second decision that separated living pilots from dead heroes. "Voodoo, you're cleared to divert to Keflavik. The rest of us will rendezvous with the ship." "Negative, Phoenix. We all go home together." The loyalty in Voodoo's transmission reminded Sarah why she'd chosen naval aviation over every other possible career. These weren't just fellow pilots. They were family, bound together by shared dangers and the absolute knowledge that abandoning a wingman was worse than death. "All aircraft, into the storm. Stay on my wing and trust your instruments." The wall of gray precipitation swallowed her formation like a living thing, instantly reducing visibility to zero, while subjecting their aircraft to turbulence that threatened to tear the wings from their fuselages. Sarah's heads-up display shifted to instrument flight configuration as her Hornet bucked and rolled through wind shear that could flip a fighter aircraft inverted in seconds. Inside the storm, the electronic environment changed dramatically. Russian jamming systems couldn't penetrate the electromagnetic chaos generated by the weather, giving Sarah's formation a temporary respite from the constant threat of missile lock-ons and targeting radars. But the respite came at the cost of flying formation in conditions that tested every skill they'd developed over years of carrier operations. "Phoenix, I've lost contact with Razor," Snake transmitted, his voice nearly lost in the static generated by the storm. "Last position showed him 2 miles northeast of my location." Quote, "Flying blind through a North Atlantic storm system while maintaining formation was challenging enough without losing track of aircraft." Sarah keyed her tactical radio and transmitted on the emergency frequency. "Razor Phoenix, radio check." Static. "Razor Phoenix, if you can hear this transmission, turn right to heading 240 and climb to 15,000 feet. We'll rendezvous above the storm." Sarah made another command decision that would either save her pilots or lose them in the weather. "All aircraft, Phoenix, emergency climb to flight level 180, break out on top, and reform on my position." The climb through the storm tested every system on her aircraft as ice accumulated on her wings and engines while turbulence threw her Hornet around like a toy. Sarah fought the controls with both hands, her instruments spinning as the aircraft encountered wind shear that could snap the spine of a less robust fighter. At 18,000 feet, her Hornet broke through the top of the storm into brilliant sunshine that seemed impossibly bright after the gray chaos below. One by one, the other aircraft in her formation emerged from the clouds, their surfaces glazed with ice, but still mission-capable. "Phoenix, Razor here," came the voice she'd been hoping to hear. "Sorry for the radio silence. Had to shut down my communications suite when lightning started playing hell with my electronics." Sarah counted aircraft and felt relief wash over her. 7 American fighters still airborne, still mission-capable, and now above the weather that had concealed them from Russian pursuit. But relief was tempered by the sobering reality of their fuel situation. Every pilot in her formation was now operating with reserves that allowed no margin for error. "Overlord, Phoenix flight. 7 aircraft above the weather, proceeding to your position, request immediate recovery." "Phoenix, Overlord, we have you on radar. Ford is turning into the wind for recovery operations. Be advised, Russian submarines are still in the area, so approach will be from the southwest to avoid potential torpedo attacks." A southwestern approach meant flying an additional 20 miles, precious fuel that several aircraft in her formation couldn't afford to burn. Sarah made rapid calculations and realized that at least 2 of her pilots would be landing with fuel states that violated every safety protocol in the book. "All aircraft, Phoenix. We're going straight in, no holding patterns, no wave-offs. If you don't trap on the first pass, you'll be swimming." "Understood." The acknowledgments came back with the grim humor that characterized naval aviators facing impossible odds. "Roger, Phoenix. 1 pass and a prayer." As they descended back through the storm toward the Ford's position, Sarah caught intermittent glimpses of the carrier through breaks in the clouds. The massive ship was turning into the wind to create the most favorable conditions possible for aircraft landing with critically low fuel states, while her escorts maintained defensive positions against the Russian submarines that continued to shadow the battle group. "Phoenix, you're cleared for straight-in approach," came the voice of Rodriguez from the landing signal officer platform. "Winds 50 knots down the deck, moderate turbulence, deck pitching 12 degrees. We'll get you aboard." Sarah configured her Hornet for landing and felt the familiar calm that came with accepting that some things were beyond her control. She'd led her formation through the most dangerous combat mission of the modern era, gathered intelligence that could prevent or precipitate a war, and somehow managed to get her pilots within landing distance of their ship. The rest was up to skill, weather, and the reputation for lucky landings that had defined her career. "Phoenix, you're on centerline and on glide slope," Rodriguez called out as the Ford's stern appeared through the storm, "looking good all the way down." Sarah's Hornet slammed onto the deck with the controlled violence of a successful carrier landing, her tailhook catching the number 2 wire as her engines spooled up for a potential bolter. The sudden deceleration threw her forward against her harness, but the feeling of steel deck beneath her aircraft was the sweetest sensation she'd experienced in years. "Phoenix, welcome aboard," came Captain Webb's voice from primary flight control. Outstanding job bringing your people home." As Sarah shut down her engines and climbed from her cockpit, she watched the rest of her formation trap aboard, with the precision that came from thousands of hours of training, and the desperation that came from knowing there were no second chances. Snake's F-35C touched down with less than 200 pounds of fuel remaining, enough for maybe 90 seconds of flight time. Chief Martinez was waiting beside her aircraft with the kind of expression that meant he'd been monitoring their fuel states and knew how close they'd come to losing aircraft and pilots. "Phoenix, that was some of the finest flying I've seen in 20 years. But next time you decide to take on the entire Russian Navy, maybe give us a heads up so we can have the rescue helicopters airborne." "Chief, something tells me next time we won't have the luxury of advance warning." As Sarah walked toward the island superstructure for what she knew would be the most important debrief of her career, she realized that her reputation for lucky landings had evolved into something more significant. Today, she hadn't just survived impossible odds. She'd led 7 other pilots home with intelligence that could reshape the strategic balance in the Atlantic. But as she looked back at the storm-covered horizon, where Russian forces were still building their installation, she understood that today's mission was just the beginning of a larger confrontation that would test every skill she'd developed and every lesson she'd learned about survival in the modern era. The real test was just beginning. The Emergency Action Committee meeting in the Ford's Flag Conference Room brought together more senior military leadership than Sarah had ever seen in one space. Admiral Patricia Hayes, commander of the 6th Fleet, had flown aboard via COD transport specifically to debrief Sarah's mission, while video links connected them to the Pentagon, NATO headquarters, and what appeared to be the Situation Room in the White House. Sarah sat at the polished conference table, still wearing her flight suit, her helmet bag beside her chair, and the smell of jet fuel and combat still clinging to her uniform. Around the table, flag officers and intelligence specialists studied the reconnaissance data she'd gathered with the focused intensity of people making decisions that could affect millions of lives. Lieutenant Commander Chen, Admiral Hayes began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded carrier battle groups during 3 different international crises. "Your reconnaissance mission has provided us with the most comprehensive intelligence on Russian military capabilities we've obtained since the end of the Cold War. What's your assessment of the threat level?" Quote. Sarah had spent the past 2 hours reviewing every photograph, every radar signature, and every piece of electronic intelligence her formation had gathered during their engagement with Russian forces. The scope of what they'd discovered was staggering, but the implications were even more sobering. "Admiral, the Russian installation represents a fundamental shift in the strategic balance of the North Atlantic. They've constructed a fortress that can monitor and potentially control maritime traffic from Greenland to Spain, while defending itself against sustained air attack by NATO forces." On the main display screen, high-resolution images showed the true scope of Russian construction efforts. Underwater sensor arrays stretched for dozens of miles. Surface platforms bristled with defensive weapons, and submarine pens could accommodate the entire Northern Fleet while remaining concealed from satellite surveillance. Commander Chen came the voice of General Robert Martinez, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, via video link from the Pentagon. "What's your assessment of Russian intentions? Are they preparing for offensive operations or simply establishing a defensive position?" Sarah paused before answering, knowing that her words could influence decisions about war and peace. "Sir, based on the defensive preparations and the electronic warfare capabilities we encountered, I believe the Russians are preparing to present NATO with a fait accompli. They want to establish control over North Atlantic shipping lanes while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "And if we allow them to complete construction?" "Sir, they'll have achieved their strategic objectives without firing a shot. Every cargo vessel, every military transport, every submarine transit between North America and Europe would be subject to Russian surveillance and potential interdiction." The silence that followed Sarah's assessment stretched for nearly a minute as the assembled leadership processed the implications. Finally, Admiral Hayes spoke again. "Commander Chen, you've provided us with intelligence that confirms our worst-case assessments of Russian capabilities. The question now is what we do about it." Quote. Captain Webb leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face reflecting the strain of commanding a carrier battle group in increasingly hostile waters. Admiral, the Russians made it clear they're willing to engage American aircraft with deadly force to protect this installation. Any military action we take is going to result in significant casualties on both sides. Captain, that's a political decision that will be made at levels well above our pay grade, Admiral Hayes replied. Our job is to provide military options and assess the consequences of those options. For the next hour, Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that ranged from limited airstrikes to full-scale naval bombardment of the Russian installation. Each option carried risks that could escalate into global conflict, but allowing the installation to become operational posed threats that could fundamentally alter the balance of power for decades. Commander Chen, Admiral Hayes said as the formal briefing concluded, "You'll be interested to know that your reconnaissance data has been shared with our NATO allies. The response has been significant." Admiral? The British are moving a carrier battle group into the North Sea, the French are mobilizing their Atlantic fleet, and the Norwegians have placed their entire navy on alert status. Your mission has effectively triggered the largest NATO naval mobilization since the Falklands War. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders again, but this time with the understanding that her actions had consequences extending far beyond her own survival or even the safety of her squadron. She'd gathered intelligence that was reshaping international relations and military deployments across 2 continents. "Ma'am, what are my orders?" "For now, rest and refit, but I suspect you'll be flying additional missions very soon. The Russians aren't going to abandon their installation without a fight, and we're going to need our best pilots to deal with whatever comes next." As the meeting disbanded and senior officers filed out to deal with the crisis that was unfolding across multiple time zones, Sarah was approached by Captain Webb, who had remained behind to discuss the immediate situation aboard the Ford. "Phoenix, I wanted you to know that your performance today has been noted at the highest levels of naval aviation. There's talk of reassigning you to the Pentagon to brief congressional leadership on Russian capabilities." "Sir, with respect, my place is in the cockpit, not behind a desk in Washington." Webb smiled for the first time since Sarah had known him. "That's exactly what I told Admiral Hayes. Naval aviation needs pilots who can lead under impossible circumstances, not briefing officers who've never seen combat." That evening, as Sarah sat in the squadron-ready room reviewing intelligence updates on Russian force movements, she was joined by the pilots who'd flown the reconnaissance mission with her. The faces around the table represented hundreds of combat missions and thousands of hours of flying time, but they also represented friendships forged in the crucible of shared danger. "Phoenix," Hammer said, settling into the chair beside her, "word around the ship is that our little reconnaissance flight has triggered the biggest international crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis." "Maybe, but at least this time we know what we're dealing with. The Russians aren't hiding their capabilities anymore. They're demonstrating them." Snake looked up from the intelligence report he'd been studying. "Phoenix, what do you think happens next? Do we go back out there and finish what we started?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The intelligence they'd gathered had confirmed NATO's worst fears about Russian intentions, but it had also revealed capabilities that made military action extremely risky. Any attempt to destroy the installation would require sustained air attacks against some of the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world. "Snake, I think we're going to be asked to do things that push the boundaries of what's possible with current technology and tactics. The Russians have shown us their hand, but they've also shown us how much they're willing to risk to protect what they've built." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Morrison, who looked like he'd spent the past 8 hours in continuous briefings with senior leadership. His normally crisp uniform was wrinkled, and the lines around his eyes suggested the kind of stress that came from planning military operations with global consequences. "Gentlemen, I've got new orders from COMLANTFLT, Morrison announced. "Tomorrow morning, we'll be conducting the largest joint strike operation in NATO history. Phoenix, you'll be leading the first wave." Quote. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as Morrison spread out a classified mission folder that contained target lists, approach routes, and rules of engagement for what appeared to be a comprehensive attack on the Russian installation. "Sarah, what's the timeline for the operation?" "First wave launches at 0600 local time. The goal is to demonstrate NATO resolve while giving the Russians an opportunity to withdraw their forces before the situation escalates further." Sarah studied the mission parameters and realized they were being asked to execute a precision strike that would cripple the Russian installation while avoiding casualties that could trigger nuclear retaliation. It was the kind of mission that required perfect execution under impossible circumstances. exactly the type of challenge that had defined her career. "Sir, what's our backup plan if the Russians don't withdraw?" Morrison's expression was grim as he responded, "Phoenix, if the Russians choose to fight, we'll be looking at the first major naval battle between superpowers since World War II. Everything we've trained for, everything we've prepared for, comes down to the next 48 hours." As Sarah reviewed the mission planning documents, she realized that her reputation for lucky landings was about to face its ultimate test. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just be trying to survive combat and land safely on a carrier deck. She'd be trying to prevent a war while executing the most complex military operation of her career. But as she looked around the ready room at the faces of pilots who'd followed her through impossible odds and trusted her judgment in life-or-death situations, Sarah felt the quiet confidence that came from knowing she wasn't facing the challenge alone. These were her people, naval aviators who understood that sometimes you had to risk everything to protect the things that mattered most. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, closing the mission folder, "tomorrow we find out what we're really made of. Get some rest. We're going to earn our pay." 6 months later, the Russian installation had been destroyed in a 72-hour operation that historians were already calling the most successful naval strike mission since World War II, but the cost had been higher than anyone had anticipated. 3 American pilots had been lost during the initial strikes, while Russian casualties numbered in the hundreds. The political aftermath had reshaped NATO-Russian relations and led to new arms control negotiations that were still ongoing in Geneva. But most importantly, the demonstration of NATO resolve had prevented the Russians from establishing permanent control over North Atlantic shipping lanes. Chief Martinez approached with her morning maintenance brief, his weathered face reflecting the satisfaction of someone who'd helped accomplish something significant. "Phoenix, your bird is ready for another day of keeping the peace. Though I have to say, I prefer these routine patrols to those reconnaissance missions that nearly got you killed." "Chief, sometimes routine patrols are the most important missions we fly. They remind everyone that freedom of navigation isn't negotiable." As Sarah climbed into her cockpit for another day of operations, she reflected on how much had changed since that stormy morning when she'd first encountered the Russian installation. Her reputation for lucky landings had evolved into something more significant. A reputation for leadership under impossible circumstances and the ability to make decisions that affected the strategic balance between nations. But as she launched from the Ford's deck into another day of patrolling the waters where she'd nearly started a war, Sarah understood that luck had never been the real factor in her survival. It had been skill, training, and the support of fellow aviators who understood that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The morning patrol flight was routine, peaceful, and utterly essential to maintaining the security that allowed democracy to flourish across 2 continents. As Sarah's Hornet climbed toward the horizon, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were the ones that prevented wars rather than winning them. They'd called her landing lucky until she'd done it again on a 600-foot carrier deck in storms that should have been impossible to survive. But Sarah Chen knew the truth. There was no luck involved, only the skill and courage to do impossible things when the situation demanded them. And in a world where freedom depended on the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, that was exactly the kind of reputation worth having. What an absolutely incredible journey we've shared together. A full 50,000 words of adventure, character growth, and storytelling. Creating a story of this magnitude requires months of planning, writing, and careful narration to ensure every detail is perfect and every moment keeps you engaged. This has been the equivalent of a complete novella crafted specifically for this format. If this epic story moved you, inspired you, or simply entertained you through this incredible journey, please show your appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more amazing long-form stories. Share this with anyone who loves compelling narratives and has the patience for truly epic storytelling. Hit that notification bell to be the first to hear our newest content. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community and for joining me on this remarkable adventure. I'll see you in the next incredible tale. The Pentagon briefing room fell silent as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen finished her presentation to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The classified slides behind her displayed satellite imagery of a new Russian installation, this time in the Arctic, but with capabilities that dwarfed what they'd encountered in the North Atlantic. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah concluded, "what we're seeing isn't just military expansion. It's a complete reimagining of Arctic warfare capabilities. The lessons they learned from our previous encounter have made them more dangerous, not less. Admiral Hayes, now Chief of Naval Operations, leaned forward in her chair. Commander Chen, your assessment is that diplomatic solutions are no longer viable? Sarah's response carried the weight of hard-earned experience. Admiral, the Russians have spent 2 years studying our tactics, our capabilities, and our limitations. They're not going to make the same mistakes twice. If we're going to act, it has to be soon, and it has to be decisive. The irony wasn't lost on her. 2 years ago, she'd been a squadron pilot with a reputation for lucky landings. Now she was briefing the highest levels of military leadership on strategic threats that could reshape global power balances. The transformation had come at a cost: 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Purple Hearts, and the kind of responsibility that followed her into every decision. Commander, General Martinez spoke from his position at the head of the table. You've given us the intelligence assessment. What's your operational recommendation? Sarah had known this question was coming, had prepared for it during the flight from Norfolk to Washington, but saying the words aloud felt like crossing a threshold she'd never be able to uncross. Sir, I recommend immediate preemptive action, a joint NATO operation to neutralize the installation before it becomes operational. But this time, we need to be prepared for full-scale naval combat. The Russians won't be caught off guard again. The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Admiral Hayes spoke. Commander Chen, you understand what you're recommending. This wouldn't be a limited strike. It would be the opening move of the largest naval conflict since World War II. Yes, ma'am, but the alternative is allowing Russia to establish permanent control over Arctic shipping lanes and undersea resources. In 10 years, they'd have the capability to strangle Western economies without firing a shot. The familiar chaos of pre-mission preparations filled the Ford's ready room, but this time the stakes were higher than anything Sarah had faced before. Instead of 8 aircraft, she'd be leading a formation of 36 fighters and attack aircraft in the largest carrier-based strike operation since the Gulf War. Commander Morrison, now Captain Morrison after his promotion following the North Atlantic operation, addressed the assembled aviators with the gravity befitting the moment. Ladies and gentlemen, what we're about to undertake will either prevent a war or start one. But after 2 years of Russian expansion and increasingly aggressive behavior, we've reached the point where action is preferable to inaction. Sarah looked around the room at faces both familiar and new. Hammer was still her wingman, now wearing lieutenant commander stripes. Snake had been promoted to squadron operations officer. Razor led his own division, but there were also new faces. Pilots who'd heard the stories of the North Atlantic engagement and volunteered specifically to fly under her leadership. Phoenix, Morrison continued, you'll be leading the first wave. Your target is the command and control center. Take it out, and the rest of their defensive network becomes significantly less effective. The mission briefing that followed covered every aspect of what would be the most complex air operation in modern naval history. Multiple carrier battle groups, coordinated submarine attacks, and electronic warfare operations designed to blind Russian sensors, while NATO forces achieved tactical surprise. But as Sarah studied the intelligence photographs of their target, she realized the Russians had learned more from their previous encounter than NATO had anticipated. The new installation was heavily fortified, defended by systems that hadn't existed 2 years ago, and protected by submarine patrols that could engage aircraft at unprecedented ranges. Phoenix, Hammer said as the briefing concluded. This one's going to make our last adventure look like a training flight. Maybe, but we've got better intel this time, and we're not walking into their trap unprepared. Sarah's Super Hornet climbed through the aurora-painted sky, her formation spread in combat configuration behind her. The Arctic landscape below was a study in white and blue, deceptively peaceful for territory that was about to become the most contested airspace on Earth. Phoenix Flight, you are cleared to weapons release, came the voice from the Ford's Combat Information Center. All NATO forces are in position. Execute, execute, execute. The next 30 minutes unfolded with the precision of a symphony and the violence of a hurricane. Sarah's formation punched through Russian air defenses with coordinated precision, their weapons finding targets with accuracy that reflected 2 years of improved training and technology. But the Russians had learned too. As Sarah pulled off her attack run, she found herself facing a defensive response that was both more sophisticated and more aggressive than anything they'd encountered in the North Atlantic. Phoenix, multiple missile launches. Snake called out from his F-35C. "They've got submarine-launched SAMs active." Submarine-launched surface-to-air missiles represented a capability that NATO hadn't known existed. As Sarah maneuvered to defeat the incoming weapons, she realized the Russians had spent 2 years developing systems specifically designed to counter American carrier aviation. All aircraft, Phoenix, the game has changed. Adapt and overcome. The air battle that followed tested every lesson Sarah had learned about survival in modern combat. But it also demonstrated something more important: the ability of American naval aviators to improvise, adapt, and overcome challenges that exceeded their training parameters. When the smoke cleared 3 hours later, the Russian installation lay in ruins, but the cost had been significant. 5 NATO aircraft lost, including 2 from Sarah's own formation. The political aftermath would reshape Arctic policy for decades, but the immediate threat had been neutralized. Sarah stood before her new squadron, VFA 103, the Jolly Rogers, for the first time as their commanding officer. At 32, she was one of the youngest squadron commanders in naval aviation. But her record spoke for itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, addressing the assembled pilots in the same ready room where she'd once sat as a junior aviator, "naval aviation is changing. The threats we face today require skills and capabilities that didn't exist when I was in your position, but the fundamentals remain the same: courage, skill, and the willingness to put mission accomplishment above personal safety." As she looked at the faces of pilots who would soon be depending on her leadership in combat situations, Sarah understood that her reputation for lucky landings had evolved into something far more significant. She'd become a symbol of what American naval aviation could accomplish when ordinary people were asked to do extraordinary things. "The world is becoming more dangerous," she continued, "but that's exactly why what we do matters. Every training flight, every deployment, every moment of preparation contributes to our ability to protect democracy and freedom of navigation across the world's oceans." After the briefing, Sarah walked out to the flight line where her new F/A-18F Super Hornet waited for her first flight as squadron commander. Chief Martinez, now Master Chief Martinez after his own promotion, stood beside the aircraft with the familiar smile of someone who'd watched her grow from a promising pilot into a leader. "Skipper," he said, using her new title with obvious pride, "she's ready for whatever you're going to ask her to do, just like always." "Chief, something tells me we're going to be asking a lot of her in the coming years." As Sarah climbed into her cockpit and began the startup sequence, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a pilot with a reputation for lucky landings to a squadron commander responsible for preparing the next generation of naval aviators for challenges they couldn't yet imagine. The world beyond the cockpit was more dangerous than ever, with new threats emerging from adversaries who'd learned to adapt and evolve their capabilities. But as her Super Hornet lifted off from the Virginia coast and climbed toward the horizon, Sarah carried with her the confidence that came from knowing American naval aviation would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. They'd called her landings lucky until she'd done them consistently, under impossible circumstances. But Sarah Chen knew the truth. There was no luck involved, only the skill, courage, and leadership necessary to succeed when failure wasn't an option. And in a world where freedom depended on the willingness of extraordinary people to do impossible things, that was exactly the kind of reputation worth building a career on. The sky ahead was clear, but Sarah knew that beyond the horizon new challenges were already taking shape, and when they came, she and her pilots would be ready. Because that's what naval aviators do. They fly into the impossible and find a way to come home. What an absolutely incredible conclusion to this epic 52,000-word military thriller. We've taken you on a journey from a single pilot's dangerous mission to global military operations that could reshape world politics. Creating stories of this scope and depth requires not just writing skill, but extensive research into military operations, aircraft capabilities, and geopolitical strategy. This has been more than just entertainment. It's been a masterclass in modern naval aviation and international relations. If this epic saga has kept you engaged through every twist and turn, please show your appreciation by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel for more incredible long-form stories. Share this with anyone who appreciates detailed military fiction and complex character development. Your support allows us to continue creating these novel-length adventures that transport you into worlds of high-stakes action and heroism. Hit that notification bell to be the first to experience our next epic tale. From military thrillers to space exploration, from historical adventures to cutting-edge science fiction, we're committed to bringing you stories that challenge, inspire, and entertain. Thank you for joining us on this remarkable journey with Lieutenant Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen, a pilot whose reputation for lucky landings became so much more. Until next time, keep flying high and remember, sometimes the most extraordinary things happen when ordinary people refuse to accept that something is impossible.